Hollywood has always been more comfortable with science fiction as spectacle than as philosophy. Every film on this list has a specific, nameable story of institutional failure. Studios that rewrote endings without the director's knowledge, released films 8 months before they were finished, lost irreplaceable footage in a salt mine, or used an actress's drowning death as a pretext to abandon a production they wanted to walk away from. These are movies that failed because they were trying to ask something the studio apparatus was not equipped to support, and the story of how each film was buried is as compelling as the film itself. Number 10. Blade Runner, 1982. At number 10, the most famous entry on this list, placed here because its case is the one everyone already knows, and because it is, without argument, the defining example of studio interference with a director's vision in the entire history of cinema. After a grueling production on smoke-filled soundstages, Ridley Scott delivered a neo-noir set in 2019 Los Angeles about a man hunting artificial humans who may be more human than he is. Test audiences in Denver and Dallas found it confusing. Warner Brothers panicked. Their solution was twofold and devastating. First, they hired Harrison Ford to record a film noir voiceover that explained every plot point, a narration Ford has described as among the worst experiences of his professional life, delivered in a tone of barely concealed contempt for the material. Second, they removed Scott's ending and replaced it with stolen footage from The Shining, showing Ford and Sean Young driving through a sunlit landscape to a hopeful conclusion categorically untrue to everything the film had established. Scott was not consulted. He found out from a crew member. The version 1982 audiences saw was, in his own words, not his film. It was released on the same day as The Thing, also on this list, 2 weeks after E.T., had redefined what audiences expected from science fiction. Both films were crushed under that cultural moment. What most people don't fully know is the restoration timeline. An unauthorized screening of Scott's original work print in Los Angeles in 1991 drew such enthusiastic response that Warner Brothers finally agreed to work on a director's cut. Scott was still not fully satisfied. The definitive final cut, the only version he fully endorses, was not released until 2007, 25 years after the original theatrical release. That is how long it took to see the film he actually made. There is no clearer illustration of what Hollywood buried too soon means. Start here. Number 9. The Thing, 1982. Number 9 was released on June 25, 1982, the same day as Blade Runner, 2 weeks after E.T. had opened to the kind of cultural rapture that redefined what science fiction was supposed to feel like. On the same day, 2 of the most important science fiction films ever made arrived in theaters and were both crushed by the gravitational pull of a third. John Carpenter had not yet experienced failure on this scale. Halloween, The Fog, and Escape from New York had made him one of the most bankable directors in Hollywood. Universal gave him his biggest budget. He used it to make a film about an alien organism that infiltrates an Antarctic research station and assimilates its human hosts, replicating them perfectly, indistinguishably, from the inside out, until no one can trust anyone else, and paranoia becomes the only rational response to every interaction. Rob Bottin's practical creature effects remain the most extraordinary body horror in cinema history. Bottin was hospitalized for exhaustion during production. The chest defibrillator sequence, in which an apparently dead man's torso opens and bites off a doctor's arms before extruding a head on a stalk and beginning to autonomously flee, was described by Carpenter as the most shocking thing he had ever filmed. Critics in 1982 called it grotesque and nihilistic. 2 weeks before our movie comes out, Carpenter said in 1999, they released this other movie called E.T., and there's this burst of love all around this movie. 2 weeks later, out comes my movie, and my movie is exactly the opposite of E.T. It is a downer. It is the grimmest thing you have ever seen. The Thing's burial was not editorial interference, but chronological misfortune compounded by critical hostility. The film was not recut or mismarketed. It was simply positioned by the universe in the worst possible cultural moment. Critics who might have championed it instead wrote it off as a reaction against the warmth of Spielberg's film, Carpenter entered a professional and creative crisis that lasted years. By the late 1980s, it was already being reassessed. It is now considered among the 10 greatest science fiction films ever made. Number 8. Event Horizon, 1997. At number 8, the most operationally tragic entry on this list, because the film that exists is not the film that was made, and unlike Blade Runner, whose missing footage was restored over decades, the footage cut from Event Horizon is gone. Irretrievably gone. The definitive version of this film can never be seen by anyone alive. In 2047, a rescue vessel is sent to investigate the reappearance of the Event Horizon, an experimental spacecraft that vanished 7 years earlier after testing a gravity drive capable of folding space. The ship went somewhere. Whatever that somewhere was, it sent the ship back fundamentally altered, with something aboard that should not exist. Paul W.S. Anderson shot approximately 130 minutes. Paramount, after test screenings, demanded cuts. The theatrical version runs 106 minutes. Anderson believes the correct version would be around 130 minutes, and that the missing 30 minutes would significantly change the experience of the film. What happened to the footage is one of cinema's strangest appendices. When Anderson and the studio became interested in assembling a director's cut after DVD sales demonstrated significant audience enthusiasm, they went looking for the excised material. Paramount had not stored it properly. Some was discovered in a deteriorated state in a salt mine in Transylvania. Most was beyond recovery. The footage is gone. Based on crew accounts and brief fragments on the DVD release, the missing material included extended sequences depicting each crew member's personal hells, visions the ship generates from their worst memories, and significantly more graphic violence in the third act. The theatrical cut implies these things. Anderson's version showed them. The film has grown steadily in cult esteem since its theatrical failure. Its specific horror, a spacecraft that has been to hell and brought hell back, operates on a frequency of pure dread that even the studio-mandated truncation cannot fully suppress. The tragedy is not what the film is. It is what the film was. Number 7. Tron, 1982. All right, we are shifting now from films you definitely know to films you know but haven't fully understood in context. Number 7 invented modern visual effects filmmaking. It is the direct ancestor of every CGI-heavy film released in the past 40 years, and was disqualified from the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects because the Academy decided that using computers was cheating. This is not a metaphor. This is what happened. Kevin Flynn, Jeff Bridges, is a hacker who is digitized and pulled into the virtual world inside a mainframe computer, where programs exist as gladiatorial combatants under the tyranny of the Master Control Program. Disney in 1982 was a studio operating on creative autopilot. Tron was an anomaly in its own studio. Genuinely adventurous, visually unprecedented, and philosophically interested in questions of identity and authorship that no Disney product had approached before or would approach again for decades. The visual language of Tron was so new, it confused everyone who encountered it. Disney's own traditional animators refused to work on it, concerned that CGI would replace them, and were exiled to an office in the studio parking lot for the duration of production. Only about 15 minutes of the film is actually computer-generated. The remainder uses backlit animation, matte paintings, and actor photography composited into the digital world by hand, frame by frame, on graph paper. The entire film was rendered on 2 megabytes of memory. What most people don't know is the Lasseter connection. Tron directly inspired John Lasseter, then a Disney animator, to pursue computer graphics as the future of cinema. Disney fired him in 1983 for promoting CGI. He went on to co-found Pixar. The film that got him fired changed the entire history of animated filmmaking. The Academy's decision has since been acknowledged by the Academy itself as a profound institutional error. They didn't disqualify it for quality reasons. They disqualified it because they didn't have a conceptual framework for what they had seen. Number 6. Sunshine, 2007. Number 6 is the finest science fiction film of the 2000s that almost nobody talks about. A work of such sustained visual and philosophical ambition that its commercial failure, engineered largely by Fox Searchlight's decision to give it minimal marketing support and a limited release, constitutes one of the decade's most consequential acts of studio indifference. Danny Boyle and Alex Garland, fresh off 28 Days Later, set their film in 2057 aboard the Icarus II, a spacecraft carrying a stellar bomb the size of Manhattan toward a dying sun. The mission is humanity's last chance to reignite the star before Earth freezes. The film is about what 8 people do to themselves and to each other under the weight of responsibility for every human life that has ever existed. Boyle and cinematographer Alwyn Kuchler construct the sun as a genuinely alien presence, overwhelming, indifferent, physically dangerous, paradoxically seductive. And the film's relationship to its own light source creates a visual experience unlike anything else in the genre. It is the kind of film that makes you aware of the screen as a physical object emitting something. The third act is famously divisive. The film pivots toward horror in a way some viewers find jarring. This is the argument your segment needs to make. The third act is not a structural failure, but a deliberate rupture. The intrusion of irrationality and madness into a film organized around scientific discipline. The sun breaks everyone who comes close enough to it, including the film's own genre conventions. Fox Searchlight opened it in limited release, gave it almost no advertising spend, and moved on quickly. This was a film that required the patient, word-of-mouth platform release that Boyle's name and Garland's script deserved. It never got one. Its reputation has grown enormously through streaming, where it consistently appears on best-of-decade lists for anyone willing to find it. Not enough people are looking. Top 5. The films from here have specific, documented stories of institutional burial that go beyond neglect into something considerably more deliberate. Number 5. Enemy Mine, 1985. At number 5, a film with 2 extraordinary stories. The first is the film itself, a genuinely moving science fiction parable about human and alien reconciliation. The second is what happened before that film existed, which is one of Hollywood's great production disasters, and one of the clearest examples of a studio actively destroying and then reshaping a director's vision. Dennis Quaid plays human pilot Willis Davidge. Louis Gossett Jr. plays Drac warrior Jeriba Shigan, enemies in an ongoing interstellar war, marooned together on a volcanic, inhospitable planet. Their survival requires cooperation. Cooperation requires communication. Communication requires understanding. The film is about what that process looks like across a species barrier, and it is completely sincere about that question in a way mainstream science fiction rarely attempts. Production began in 1984 under director Richard Loncraine, shooting in Iceland. After $9 million had been spent and the footage reviewed, Fox shut it down. Loncraine was fired. The Iceland footage was abandoned. Wolfgang Petersen, Das Boot, was brought in to restart from scratch in a purpose-built environment in Munich. The original $17 million budget expanded to over $40 million. The film earned $2.3 million in its opening weekend against a break-even point of approximately $80 million when marketing was factored in. What most people don't know is the Soviet anomaly. Enemy Mine was the first Western science fiction film shown in Soviet Union theaters, where it was enormously popular. Its message, that the distinction between enemy and human dissolves when 2 beings must depend on each other to survive, resonated in ways that American audiences in 1985, during Reagan-era Cold War escalation, may not have been culturally prepared to receive. Gossett Jr.'s performance as Jeriba, delivered under hours of prosthetic makeup that completely disguised his face, is a work of physical and vocal invention that deserved far more recognition than it received. The film's emotional honesty about the difficulty of understanding a genuinely different kind of mind remains completely intact. Number 4. Serenity, 2005. Number 4 is the only film on this list buried primarily by the ghost of something else specifically by its origin as the continuation of a television series that Fox had canceled after airing only 11 of 14 produced episodes in a scrambled order at an inconsistent time slot, then claimed the low ratings justified the decision. Joss Whedon managed something near impossible, convincing Universal Pictures to fund a theatrical continuation of a canceled series based purely on the enthusiasm of its fan community. Serenity follows the crew of a smuggling vessel as they uncover a government secret about River Tam, a traumatized psychic whose recovery of suppressed memories puts the entire Alliance government at risk. Chiwetel Ejiofor's operative, an assassin with no personal name, no self-interest beyond service to a government he knows is corrupt, and a philosophical clarity about the necessity of his own evil, is one of the decade's great antagonists. The film's third-act revelation about the planet Miranda and what the Alliance did there in the name of social improvement lands with a genuine force that transcends its franchise context. Universal opened Serenity wide, but without conviction. The studio had never fully understood what the Firefly audience was or how large it was, and the marketing was built around generic sci-fi spectacle rather than the character-specific emotional investment that was its actual selling point. The existing fan base showed up. The general audience did not. Universal canceled plans for sequels and moved on. The franchise died a second time. What most people don't know is how precisely the film functions as a standalone. It requires no Firefly context. Its argument, that governments create the monsters they most fear, and that the people who discover this are the most dangerous citizens of all, is completely self-contained. It was buried partly by its own origin story. Number 3. Explorers, 1985. We are in the top 3. From here, the burial stories become considerably more specific and considerably more egregious. Number 3 is the only film on this list released before it was finished, pushed out of production mid-edit by a studio that wanted to win a scheduling competition. It had no business entering, released to audiences in a state its director has described as a rough cut, 8 months from completion. 3 teenage boys in a small Ohio town, Ben, Wolfgang, and Darren, discover that Ben's recurring dream of a circuit board is a signal, build a spacecraft from salvage, and fly it into orbit, where they are collected by an alien vessel. That is the film. What makes it matter is who Ben and Wolfgang are, Ethan Hawke and River Phoenix, in their very first screen appearances, before anyone knew their names. Joe Dante's direction of the film's first 2 acts is among his finest work, a precise distillation of the specific melancholy and wonder of American suburban adolescence. The first hour of Explorers is the movie Dante wanted to make, and it is excellent. In late spring 1985, with the film still in active editing and roughly 8 months from a planned release, Paramount decided to move the date to early July, directly into the summer market, where they believed it could compete with Back to the Future. Dante and his team were told to stop cutting. The film was frozen in its unfinished state and printed for distribution. They said, "Just stop editing the picture, we're going to put it out," Dante recalled. The alien sequences in the theatrical version are consequently underdeveloped and tonally inconsistent with the first hour, a shift widely interpreted as a directorial choice when it is actually the scar of an incomplete process. Whatever Paramount did to Explorers, it could not touch the performances. Watching Hawke and Phoenix together, knowing what both would become and what Phoenix would not, gives the film an emotional register no amount of studio interference could manufacture or destroy. Number 2, The Fountain, 2006. Number 2 is one of the most visually extraordinary films ever made, a meditation on death, grief, love, and transcendence, shot with a physical beauty so extreme it borders on the devotional. And Warner Brothers gave it essentially no support. It earned $1.6 million worldwide against a $35 million budget, and it has been largely absent from mainstream critical conversation ever since. Darren Aronofsky's film operates across 3 parallel storylines spanning different centuries. A conquistador searching for the Tree of Life in Mayan territory. A contemporary neuroscientist desperately seeking a cure for his wife's terminal brain tumor. And a figure floating through space in a bubble containing a dying tree, approaching the Mayan underworld with ecstatic serenity. The film's argument is that the same act, the refusal to accept death, plays out across all of human history at every scale, from the personal to the cosmic. The film's visual language is unique in contemporary cinema. Rather than using CGI for its cosmic sequences, Aronofsky and cinematographer Matthew Libatique used time-lapse macro photography of chemical reactions in petri dishes, enzymes interacting with dyes on glass, magnified to create what appear to be stellar nebulae. The imagery is simultaneously microscopic and vast. That is precisely the film's thematic point. What most people don't know is that the fountain almost didn't happen at all. An earlier version was cancelled in 2002 when Brad Pitt departed the project over creative disagreements, causing the studio to withdraw $70 million in funding. Aronofsky reconceived the film at half the scale, eliminating most of the elaborate physical sets and replacing them with the macro photography approach. The constraint produced a better film. Warner Brothers appeared to have no idea how to position something that was simultaneously a love story, a philosophical treatise, a historical epic, and a visual art object. Critics called it self-serious. The same word applied to 2001 and Solaris on their initial releases. The Fountain belongs in conversation with those films as one of cinema's serious attempts to use science fiction to address genuinely metaphysical questions. Its commercial failure is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence of the near impossibility of releasing genuinely philosophical cinema through the mainstream studio apparatus. Number 1. Brainstorm, 1983. And that brings us to number 1. Every other film on this list was buried by studio anxiety, institutional conservatism, or catastrophically bad timing. Brainstorm was buried by a studio that used the drowning death of its leading actress as a pretext to collect insurance money. Rather than finish a film, it had already decided it wanted to abandon. And in doing so, ended the directorial career of one of science fiction cinema's most significant visual minds. Douglas Trumbull was the visual effects supervisor on 2001, A Space Odyssey, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Blade Runner. Brainstorm was his return to directing after a 12-year absence, built around a premise of genuine visionary ambition. Scientists develop a headset that records the full sensory and emotional experience of any moment and allows anyone to play it back directly. A colleague then records her own death and leaves the recording behind. What Trumbull was building toward, the film's final sequence, in which Christopher Walken's character plays the death recording and follows it beyond the moment of physical cessation, was intended to be a formally unprecedented cinematic experience, shot in a wider aspect ratio with different film stock to differentiate the recorded experience sequences from ordinary reality. When Natalie Wood drowned on November 29, 1981 during a break from filming, MGM, which had already been looking for reasons to shut down a production it considered too expensive and too strange, immediately used the tragedy as grounds to halt production. This was legally and practically unjustified. Wood had completed all but 2 brief scenes, and Trumbull's position was that the film could be finished without reshooting her footage. MGM locked the sets and attempted to use Wood's death to collect on the production insurance rather than complete the film. Trumbull filed suit. The legal battle lasted months. He won the right to finish the film, completing it with close-up and reverse-angle footage that avoided the 2 unshot Wood scenes. MGM then gave the finished film minimal distribution and essentially no promotion. What most people don't know is the irony. The film's plot, in which scientists are locked out of their own laboratory and their research stolen by a corporation, mirrors its director's actual experience with near-perfect precision. The studio became the film's villain in real life. Trumbull has never made another feature film. The industry's treatment of Brainstorm ended his directorial career. The film is imperfect. The MGM-enforced constraints are visible throughout. But its central sequence, in which Louise Fletcher's character records her own cardiac arrest, is among the most formally daring things attempted in mainstream science fiction cinema. It anticipates questions about consciousness, digital immortality, and the phenomenology of dying that remain entirely unresolved and entirely relevant. A studio used a woman's death to bury a film about the experience of dying. That is number one. There is nothing else it could be. If you haven't seen it, you have a genuinely strange and important evening waiting for you. Fix that immediately. From number 10 to number 1, what this list proves is that Hollywood's relationship to ambitious science fiction has always been the same. Tolerate it when it makes money, bury it when it doesn't, and call the burial a market decision rather than a failure of institutional imagination. These films were not buried because they were bad. They were buried because the studios that made them didn't know what to do with questions they couldn't turn into a franchise. The internet has spent 30 years quietly undoing that work, restoring audiences to films that were always waiting for them. This list is part of that project. But I know you have opinions. What got left off? Where is Dark Star? Where is Silent Running? Should The Fountain be higher? Should Brainstorm actually be number 1? Or is that too obscure a call? Tell me. I read everything. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. The next video is coming. And if this list told you anything about how much the industry has buried and how much is still waiting to be found, that one will take you somewhere you haven't been before.